Randomness in game design is always a tough egg to crack. Mechanics having an RNG aspect can be very interesting to play with in the right circumstances, but it can also remove a certain player-driven factor from the equation. Anyone who's played a sufficiently large amount of games can probably think of a time a random element of design has caused them a great deal of frustration, but can also remember a great moment that RNG helped create. Maybe you could say that it's akin to a very potent spice. Just enough can add some much-needed flavor to a game, but put in slightly too much and it can make the experience unpalatable. Egg Squeeze is a game about squeezing eggs. For a premise this ostensibly stupid, it's shocking how well considered the final product actually is. It manages to stay engaging from beginning to end, and throws the player curveballs and unexpected situations far more often than you might expect, considering its relatively short runtime and repetitive gameplay. What makes this achievement even more impressive is that, from what I can tell at least, the game is almost entirely random. The player is tasked with holding down mouse 1 for a period of time, during which the character squeezes an egg, racking up points along an invisible scale. The longer you squeeze, the more points you earn. Squeeze too long, however, and the egg will pop, which not only fails to score you points, but subtracts a substantial ratio of your accumulated total. So, how do you know how long to squeeze in order to avoid breaking your egg? Well, you don't. The strength of each egg shell is unknown to the player while squeezing, with the player having to use their psychokinetic intuition to estimate each egg's unique breaking point. At least, that's what it says on the store page. Mechanically, the time before each egg is broken by your character's iron grip is random, and there aren't any clues that give the player some idea of when they should let go, at least initially. There seems to be a defined minimum possible burst time, as well as some sort of maximum, but these aren't exactly easy to gauge while playing. Worth noting, too, that even if there is some sort of method to the madness, the average player won't figure it out without outside information. Because of these factors, the internal workings of Egg Squeeze retain a lot of mystery all the way through. For many games and even genres, one of the predominant appeals of play is a sense of understanding and mastery of the mechanics. As players learn more about how a title works, they integrate this new information into their understanding of the game's systems, then use that knowledge to defeat harder and harder challenges. While this is certainly very broadly appealing as an intrinsic motivator, it's not the only way to structure a game, and unfortunately, I think many designers might be convinced otherwise. If I may, I'd like to get up on my soapbox for a bit about this topic. I think too many developers are afraid of having the player interact with black boxes. What I mean by this is that, oftentimes, designers seem to want to steer away from situations in which the player has to interact with low-information mechanics, ones that the player has very limited knowledge of how to manipulate. With this sort of black box mechanic, the player feeds in inputs, which the system then generates outputs for based on internal workings that are obscured from the player. While I understand the desire to keep the playing field fair by using systems directly observable and understandable, and I don't think there's anything wrong with designing a game like this, the opposite in fact, I think there's something to be said for how obscuring these processes can produce experiences that wouldn't be possible otherwise. Egg Squeeze is a perfect example of this in action. Because the player is fed next to zero information about the hardness of their eggs, a certain experience emerges that is among the most unique of any game I've played. Squeezing too long is still the player's fault, as they had every opportunity to stop earlier. However, it's hard to find some personal liability when you break an egg, because you have no way to know its upper limit. It's both the player's fault for being greedy, but also not something they will blame themselves for, because they were interacting with a black box. Overall, this has the effect of keeping each instance of egg squeezing both tense and confident. The game does a good job keeping the player in a state of tension with its lack of information. As you squeeze, the tension grows and grows until you release or break the egg. At the same time, the player won't feel particularly bad about breaking an egg or two, which enables them to keep squeezing aggressively and with conviction. Some of this game's best moments are when the player squeezes right up to the limit, so it's in the game's best interest to have a player attempt this as much as possible. It's simultaneously confidence-inducing and tense, without either undermining the other. I don't think the game would have been able to mix two seemingly opposed emotions so effectively if it wasn't so opaque. What's so fun about this unclear system as well is that players will naturally end up creating their own half-baked scientific approach to squeezing. There's plenty of details the player can latch onto in order to generate a strategy, even if that tactic doesn't have a mechanical basis. Maybe you might think there's some sort of pattern, where the length of time you can squeeze changes in a predictable order. Maybe the message you get from the game after every round has some effect. Maybe it's the music, with each track having its own maximum time. That's what I thought for a while myself. I found myself grasping at straws while playing for the first time, trying to get any concrete info I could from a system that seemed to offer as little as possible. In retrospect, I think this thought process really helped shape my perception of the game. There's an aspect of experimentation here that's possible only because of how obscured the internal workings of the system are. Players will naturally become more immersed in a game when their brain is working to construct and test new strategies. And it's great Egg Squeeze manages to foster this while also being as random as it is. Funnily enough, I think Egg Squeeze is aided in this immensely by the culture surrounding games. Because so few games are structured with such little internal clarity, players naturally expect a game to present a clear and unambiguous set of challenges. In turn, this causes players to try and find points of consistency the game is leaving for them, even if those clues don't actually exist. I felt this when playing for the first time, and I'd expect many others did as well. This is an aspect of the scarcity of black box designs that a savvy designer can take advantage of, and Egg Squeeze does to a highly commendable degree.
Oh yeah, that boy.
Up to this point, I've limited my talking points to the basics of the game's mechanics to avoid unnecessary spoilers. That stops here. The rest of the video covers what the player will experience in the later stages of play. As this game is best experienced as blind as possible, I highly recommend playing the game before continuing past this point. It's short, sweet, and only $4. If anything I've said about it interests you, stop here and go check it out for yourself. The only thing I'll advise is to avoid looking at a guide until you finish the game at least. Trust me, as blind as possible is the way to go. Earlier, I implied that there isn't a concrete method the player can use to avoid breaking the egg. But that's not entirely true. Because there's a minimum possible time the egg will break in, what happens if we hold mouse 1 for under a second, let go, and do that repeatedly to score small amounts of points without risk of failure? Turns out, the game is onto your tricks. Your egg will break instantly after a few repeats of this. While it's great this possibility was predicted and given an amusing on-theme solution, it isn't a perfect fix. At minimum, the time to break an egg is 3 seconds. The system responsible for detecting if a player is using this strategy doesn't stop the player if they hold mouse 1 for more than a couple seconds, which leaves an unfortunate gap that the player can exploit to score an arbitrarily large amount of points with no risk. In case you're wondering how possible this is to figure out during a first playthrough, I started doing something similar without outside information during mine, and I'd expect others did as well. It's only natural that in a game with a focus on experimentation with a black box, players will naturally stumble across cracks in the system. It seems to me that the best way to fix this issue would be to expand the bounds of the detection system, such that a player has to take on at least a little risk without triggering it. Occasionally squeezing for a couple seconds is fine, we just don't want players to not think at all. I'd say, at its core, Egg Squeeze is largely focused on the player's experimentation and interaction with a black box, so it's unfortunate there's an element that can undermine that goal. The counterpoint to my proposed fix is that, without a way the player can avoid losing points, the game really is entirely random, and the player's accomplishments are undermined. While this is a fair point, I think it misses what the game is going for in the first place. Like I outlined before, this game is far more focused on instilling emotions not possible through a less random system, and I believe a game this far off the beaten path is bettered by not delving into designs so commonly seen. If you want to play a game designed around empowering the player by rewarding their choices in an understandable system, you can play 99% of other games. I think the overall issue I outlined is probably my biggest problem with Egg Squeeze, which is saying something because it isn't exactly a big deal in the first place. Considering how pedantic and exacting I can be when it comes to criticizing games, I'm happy to report that Egg Squeeze is very well made in a lot of ways. Even if you don't really care about my opinion, I hope you understand that I'm someone who's really hard to totally please, and Egg Squeeze succeeds in a great many areas that I can't find fault in at all. Throughout this review, I've kept saying things like next to no information instead of something more concrete, and there's a reason for that. During day 3, the player gains access to certain tools as they add points to their total. Some are very simple and can be understood with a bit of playtime, such as the flower and egg stock market. But most are unintuitive to the point of being extremely arcane. If there's a rule to what most of the non-obvious upgrades do, I couldn't figure it out on my own. You can look at a guide if you really want to, even though, again, I'd recommend against it. But I'm more interested in talking about what effect this ambiguity has on play. When you get an addition to your HUD, the game makes no attempt to tell you what this does, leaving the player to experiment on their own. As you might expect, this feeds into how players will come up with their own strategies, giving them more elements to experiment with, strengthening the focus on randomness in a black box system. It's good that the game adds additional factors to the equation towards the end, so as to keep players engaged, especially considering the experience doesn't have a huge amount of depth and the game isn't particularly long. That's something worth delving into a little more. Egg Squeeze is a short game compared to most. I finished it in a bit under an hour and a half, and I'd predict most other players completed it in a similar time frame. It was a good choice to not have the game drag on any longer than necessary. Considering there isn't a whole lot to do in Egg Squeeze, keeping the game focused on the core appeal with a short and sweet runtime was definitely the right call. The core loop is liable to get old to most players after some amount of time, especially so considering the randomness of it, and this is prevented both by a short runtime, and introductions to the base formula, like the upgrades present on day 3, and the phone calls the player gets from time to time that offer them a risky deal. Back to the upgrades, it's also worth noting that they have great presentation. Some of them are probably useless, or at least mechanically negligible, but it's hard to consider them pointless visual fluff when they can be as amusing as they are, as well as feeding into the experimentation described earlier. Visuals across the board are excellent, and are overall eccentric and lively. It's a good approach for a game this unconventional. The same can be said of the soundtrack. Many different approaches and styles are present, ranging from conventionally catchy, poppy tracks, to slow, melancholic arrangements, to pure noise. Having such an eclectic bunch of songs really helps solidify Egg Squeeze's aesthetic appeal, especially so considering each track's role as an extended sound effect. Narrative elements are also similarly over the top. The story itself is absurd, which is probably a good choice considering the premise. It's also nearly entirely backloaded, with the majority of the narrative being relayed to the player after the last level. This strikes a good progression, I think. The player starts the game with the simple task to squeeze an egg, which, despite some of the more bizarre features of the visuals, is easy enough. Sanity is added on the second day, which is somewhat ominous, but the game remains similar. Day 3 adds a ton of new doodads to the HUD, which is a big jump in visual complexity compared to Day 2, and the day ends with a monologue and the player choosing an ending. I think it was a good idea to have the main draw of the game be its gameplay for the majority of the runtime, then cap the experience off with a memorable series of cutscenes. I'd imagine this really cements an unorthodox and unforgettable overall game in the player's mind after they're finished, which is a nice touch. To end off, I'd like to point out something that's been on my mind since I started writing this review, which is that it's extremely hard to accurately describe why this game is good. I try to not judge elements of design in a vacuum, because no individual element is experienced in a vacuum, but even I'd have to admit that the specifics are a bit of a hard sell. If someone tried to get you to play a game by describing it as repeatedly holding mouse 1 to guess a predetermined random time limit with next to no information, I wouldn't blame anyone for thinking that the game was probably uninteresting, crudely made, or amateurish, but the final product is miles more refined than that intuition. This really forced me to reckon with two things. First, that this game wouldn't be as engaging as it is if it didn't have great aesthetic direction. I've always been a mechanics first kind of guy, but even I'm forced to admit now and again that certain titles rely heavily on their presentation, and that there isn't anything wrong with that when executed effectively. I'd imagine Egg Squeeze's mechanics are the main reason its fans like the game, including myself, but those mechanics wouldn't be as captivating if they weren't presented with such a bold, imaginative, and eccentric art style and soundtrack. Secondly, I really came to realize how important pacing is to Egg Squeeze. Pacing is an element that, arguably, doesn't really apply to games as a medium in a reliably measurable way, considering they frequently don't move along at a constant or linear rate, the same as something like a film. Still, I think we can all agree that some games have better pacing than others, even if it's hard to quantify in many instances. Egg Squeeze's pacing is one of its defining aspects, and we can see this by looking at what emotions the game fosters on a moment-to-moment basis. I mentioned before that the game manages to keep the player tense while also inspiring them to push forward confidently, and that's also in large part to the pacing. The player holds mouse 1 for a period where tension is building. Afterward is a sort of rest period where that tension fades, and the player can briefly think about how they want to approach the next squeeze. The sound effects and music help immensely in both areas, ratcheting up the tension while squeezing, and either rewarding the player with a nice ascending sequence or giving them a slap on the wrist with a descending one. Sort of like a mini roller coaster, these sequences create an up and down emotional ride while playing, which I would imagine is, silently, one of the biggest reasons this game is so engaging. Moving between highs and lows like this can help to create an overall more memorable experience, with the downtime emphasizing the uptime more than if the whole thing was high energy. It often takes knowing when to scale back to create a thoroughly great game, and fortunately, Egg Squeeze doesn't put all its eggs in one basket.
Oh yeah.